Auburn beat Georgia in Athens. Texas beat Auburn. Georgia beat Texas. There was a little bit of a round robin with three of those top teams in the country, and I guess Miami with Howard Schnellenberger won its first national championship that year by knocking off Mike Rozier and the Nebraska Cornhuskers. It's a really fun season, and while the Georgia-Auburn game that year was certainly a disappointment, to beat Texas in the Cotton Bowl, I remember that being a very big deal for sure. No, are we on the other platforms now? All right, good morning to everybody, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. Happy to have you on all those video platforms. We'll get ready to get going here in just a moment. Looking forward to a really fun show today, and very happy to have you there for that. Matt Rukavina, obviously, who knows the Houston situation pretty well, says I'm not really, I would call Order Easy reliable at this point, but best of luck to him. He's been up and down. Yeah, listen, at this point in time, one man's trash, another man's treasure. I think there are a lot of Braves fans who are sort of ready for a fresh start without Will Smith, who, listen, will live on in great lore forever because of his contribution to a World Series. But he's been a little bit of an adventure. You know, it's funny. Like in the regular season this year, he sort of picked up where he was last year. But obviously, he will live on forever because of his contribution to the World Series. Hemingway says, "Hope we talk lots of recruiting today." We'll certainly do some of that here in a little bit. Let's see who else. A couple more comments from our folks before we get ready to go. Rageful Rem checking out on DawgNation.com and heading over to Facebook. Well, listen, no matter which platform you watch us on, we're glad to have you here. Appreciate all of that. Cat Story reminding us just 4 more Saturdays, and that's good news. Let's see. Anything else before we get started here today? It's going to be a great day. It's going to be a lot of fun. And Jesse S. checks in to say Saban can keep getting those 5-star offensive players. He's done that before, but Kirby's defense shut it down. No doubt how it all worked out last year for sure. Randy Hall mentioning we've tagged Billy Napier Sling Blade. How about Josh Heupel Sloth from Goonies? That is both unkind and funny at the same time. So good stuff. Good stuff. Hemingway says something about the show title for today. Yeah, we're going to have some fun. And we're going to try to put something in simple terms today. And I think that Stetson Bennett kind of occupies sort of an interesting place in history. And I'm going to try to describe that for you and kind of lead into, you know, what this means for the upcoming year. And maybe in some respects, some surprises here, in other respects, exactly as you assumed it would be. It seems like a good time to talk about Stetson Bennett as he returns as Georgia starting quarterback right here before the start of the 2022 season. So what do you say we get that going? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So let me begin today with what I think is a little bit of an interesting fact. We are beginning year 9 of the college football playoff era. When I think about college football, that's sort of the way in which I think about the sort of various eras of the sport. Like, we are in kind of what I think of as the most modern era, the playoff era right now. And I sort of think of what existed before this from 1998 to 2013 as the BCS era, and many of you kind of think the same way. And like everything that sort of happened within that time, I kind of clumped together. And that, to me, that's a little bit different than what we've sort of existed in the college football world with since 2014. And anything before that, even though I was alive to experience a lot of it, I just sort of think of as the dark ages, ancient history right now. If it happened pre-playoff, pre-BCS, I'm not quite so sure how relevant that is to the current age in which we live. And that's just kind of the way I think about college football. So going into year 9 of the college football playoff era, Georgia's quarterback Stetson Bennett kind of finds himself in an interesting position. He is just the 3rd quarterback in the playoff era to be a starter for his team in a national championship year and then return back the following year. I'm not really counting Tua Tagovailoa in that because Tua wasn't really a starter for Alabama in 2017. So Bennett kind of joins just 2 other guys as guys who started for their team, won a national championship, and came back the following year. And I would say in terms of Stetson Bennett and the comparison you draw with the other 2 quarterbacks in that kind of category, I think you see some pretty interesting things. And it's not necessarily all great news, but certainly it can result in a very happy ending for Bennett as he returns to Georgia here in 2022. Let me start all of this by going back to SEC Media Days. When Kirby Smart, and we talked about this yesterday, that Smart was kind of in the role of fact checker a little bit at SEC Media Days, I thought. He kind of pushed back against the prevailing narrative against his defense, maybe even some negative recruiting, that some recruits are being fed about the defense dropping off after what happened in 2021. We played you audio yesterday of Smart pushing back against that and saying, no, that's not as true as some people maybe think that it is. And when it comes to Georgia quarterback Stetson Bennett, I think there was some of this sort of fact-check stuff going on from Smart there as well about what Smart seems to think he sees as the prevailing narrative, and the fact that when Smart looks at that prevailing narrative, ultimately he doesn't really think it's all that correct. Let me kind of give you more of Kirby from Media Days on that very topic, kind of pushing back against some of what's been said about Stetson Bennett. Here's Kirby.
When we control what we do and we do the right way, Stetson can be a major factor. And look, Stetson's one of the least respected good players there is in this country. And guess what? We get to see it every day. The kid's a tremendous athlete. He's got a good arm strength. People just keep doubting him, and that's fine with me.
Kirby says, hey, people have kept, doubting him. He's a better player than he's given credit for. And that was Smart's way of kind of pushing back against some of what's been said about Stetson Bennett. And when Smart said that at SEC Media Days, I thought that was probably among the more interesting things that we heard from him when he took the podium there just a couple of weeks ago. And I think that what Smart is saying, to a certain degree, is just factually true. That there are a lot of ways in which Stetson Bennett probably really is truly better than he's been given credit for. In fact, I mentioned a moment ago, there are two other quarterbacks in the playoff era who have been a starter, helped their team win a national championship, and came back the following year. One of those guys is Trevor Lawrence. And if you look at Lawrence's national championship season in 2018, even though Lawrence went on to eventually become the number one overall pick in a future NFL draft, and that's not probably, we would think, on the horizon for Stetson Bennett, the actual truth is the overall stat line for what Lawrence did in his freshman season of 2018 when he won the national championship really isn't wildly different than what Stetson Bennett did in his national championship year of 2021. And it's an example maybe of, as Smart said, that Bennett's sort of the best, best good player that gets very little credit. Some of the stat line comparisons that you could draw for Bennett probably put him in a little bit more of a rarefied air category than maybe you might think. However, as I mentioned a moment ago, the comparison with Lawrence is also interesting for another reason as well, because Lawrence is a little bit of an example of a question I sort of hope we don't hear asked about Stetson Bennett here this upcoming season, because a lot of this is on my mind because Bennett is coming back to Georgia. That's something that a lot of national championship quarterbacks haven't always done. Bennett is returning back to UGA. And you might think, if you're only sort of a halfway casual plugged-in observer to all of this, you might think when you have won a national championship as a starting quarterback, when you return back the following year, that it's all just sort of sunshine and rainbows for you when you come back the very next year. But in the case of Trevor Lawrence in 2019, the year after winning the national championship in 2018, that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, Lawrence probably began the 2019 season as maybe the most hyped player in college football at the time. We didn't really know what Joe Burrow was going to become prior to the 2019 season. A lot of what Joe Burrow became, Lawrence was being treated as that figure going into the year. He was, I think, one of the top odds-on favorites to win the Heisman Trophy. But if you go back and look at his stat line to begin the 2019 season, frankly, it wasn't that great. He struggled a little bit against Syracuse and Georgia Tech and some opponents that you wouldn't really expect a guy like Lawrence to struggle against. In a kind of a high-profile non-conference game against Texas A&M, he didn't play particularly well. For the year, Lawrence threw 8 interceptions, and a lot of those interceptions were kind of front-loaded at the beginning of the 2019 season. If you go back and look at some of the media outlets that cover Clemson football from that time point in 2019, you saw a lot of questions being asked of, what's wrong with Trevor Lawrence? He just led Clemson to a national championship, and he came back with even higher expectations this upcoming year. But in the early stage of the season, he wasn't really playing that way. Now, to Lawrence's credit, he eventually started playing much better and got Clemson to that national championship game. But that's not the way that Lawrence was playing very early in the year. So I think about this as someone who talks about Georgia football on a regular basis. Man, I really, really hope we're not asking that question about Stetson Bennett. I really, really hope that Bennett coming back to Georgia for for this upcoming year. And of course, I'm saying this as a fan. I'm saying this as a partisan here. But I really, really hope that Bennett doesn't find himself dealing with some of what Trevor Lawrence dealt with early in the season in 2019, when he wasn't quite playing as well as a seasoned veteran would be expected to, as a, in Lawrence's case, former number 1 overall recruit, giving the football away to the other team as much as he was. It's not quite the way that Lawrence was playing there at the beginning of that season. It led to some questions of, well, what's wrong with Trevor Lawrence? Is there something wrong with Trevor Lawrence? And obviously, in the case of Bennett, who's traveling a similar path, coming back to Georgia after winning the national championship the year before, I hope we're not asking that question of Bennett here this upcoming season. But actually, there's another question beyond that I really hope we don't end up asking about Stetson Bennett, but it has been asked of another quarterback who got starting experience in a national championship year and then came back the following year. In fact, this is probably the comparison, I think, in the playoff era that probably matches the Stetson Bennett story maybe about as well as anything. Let's go back to the very first year of the college football playoff. Do you remember then when Ohio State began the year with a starting quarterback and lost him to injury, and then went with another starting quarterback and then lost him to injury, and then finally, in very surprising fashion, had to turn to Cardale Jones as its starting quarterback? And Cardale Jones, who began the year as the third-string quarterback for Ohio State, became the starter late in the season, into the postseason, and helped lead Ohio State to a national championship there in 2014, and made the decision to come back in 2015 when he maybe could have tried his hand at the NFL. Well, what a lot of you may know is that when Jones in 2014 transitioned in 2015, when he came back to the Buckeyes, when he could have gone to the NFL, eventually Cardale Jones actually lost his starting job in the 2015 season. Once again, much the same way early in the 2019 year, Trevor Lawrence was throwing too many interceptions. I think in the case of Cardale Jones, he was throwing way too many interceptions, not enough touchdowns, and eventually in 2015, Jones was replaced as the starting quarterback, and the one-time signal caller who had led Ohio State to a national championship, his story in Columbus actually has a little bit of an unhappy ending. And if you go back and look at some of like the media reports from the time, Columbus Dispatch, and some of the media outlets that cover the Buckeyes, a question that Jones got a lot at the end of the 2015 season was, do you regret coming back? Do you wish you would have gone to the NFL? Do you wish you hadn't come back to Ohio State in 2015, knowing how it all ended, knowing how the story kind of changed the year after having won a national championship? Do you regret the decision to return to the Buckeyes here in 2015? Now, to Jones' credit, he says, no, I don't regret that, and he went on to talk about why that was. But that's a question you really hope doesn't end up being asked about Stetson Bennett here for this upcoming season, because if it is, it's an example of what could happen, building on a legacy, growing as a legend, becoming even more beloved figure in Georgia lore based on what happened last year, kind of taking that twist and kind of going the other way. Now, to Bennett's credit, he's been fielding questions like this for a while, including his own appearance at SEC Media Days a few days ago. He was asked, hey, after all you did, you won the national championship. You kind of had the storybook ending. Maybe did you ever consider just sort of leaving it at that and not coming back to Georgia here for the 2022 season? These are questions that Bennett's kind of already faced before, and I think when he was asked about that last week, he gave another good answer as to why it is that he wants to be back at Georgia and continuing to add chapters to his story, even though it seemed like the ending was almost perfect last season. I thought this was good from Stetson back in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago. Take a listen to this.
You play the game to play the game, and you play the game to win and to compete against the best players. And if I'm secure enough to, I can look in the mirror, I wasn't going to get drafted high last year, right? So what was the guarantee that I was going to go start in the NFL last year? It was probably pretty low, or this next year, it was probably pretty low. And so this is the best conference in the country. If we take care of business, then we take care of business here. You're competing against the best players. You have the best players on your team, best coaches. It's the smartest league. So, and I think it's the biggest honor in the world to be able to go out there with the G on the side of my helmet and my name on the back, and look at my brothers across from me and know that we're playing for the University of Georgia and for the state of Georgia.
So listen, I think that's a great answer, and I think it's easy to understand why when you're in the midst of doing something as special as Bennett's doing, being the starting quarterback for the Georgia Bulldogs, of course you wouldn't want that story to end any sooner than it has to. Of course you want to keep going on that ride because of Bennett's, I think, special appreciation for just how special the job he has is. It's the kind of coveted position that everyone, certainly to a degree, kind of chases after, and Bennett's got that, and of course you wouldn't willingly relinquish that until you have to. But to kind of bring all this to a close here, the two other quarterbacks in the playoff era who are in the same position that Bennett is now, guys who started for their team, won a national championship to come back the following year, both had some tough questions asked of them when they did. For Trevor Lawrence, it was, what's wrong with you? After he wasn't quite playing so well to begin the following season as he was to end his national championship season before that. For Cardale Jones at Ohio State, it was, do you wish you hadn't done this after the legend of Jones seemed so much smaller at the end of the 2015 season than it did after the 2014 season? And all of this is not to suggest that Stetson Bennett's going to have an unhappy ending to his story. That's not what this topic's about. What this topic's about is, how do you avoid that? How do you keep from being the guy Trevor Lawrence that seemed to have some growing pains at the beginning of year two? Or Cardale Jones, the guy who seemed to have a hard time living up to the very best moments of his football life at the end of the 2014 season? And I think the way you avoid that, the way that you keep that from happening is actually kind of simple. You throw a lot of touchdowns and you try not to throw too many interceptions. And I know you're listening to this and you're saying, well, BA, that's the most elementary point I've ever heard. It's one thing to keep things simple. It's another thing to be simplistic. And that might sound a little too simplistic, but hear me out here for a moment, because there's actually more to that than maybe meets the eye. There's a way to be like a game manager style quarterback and avoid interceptions. But most of the quarterbacks who do that, you can go back and look at like Georgia football history and see examples of this. Some of the guys who threw the fewest interceptions over the course of a year for Georgia also didn't throw very many touchdowns either. That it's not enough just to protect the football, as we said before. Lawrence a little too, a little bit too many interceptions maybe in the early stages of 2019. Certainly Cardale Jones, way too many interceptions in sort of a short period there in 2015. Like it's easy to be too dangerous with the football and kind of hurt your team in the process. But just protecting the football alone is not enough. You've also got to go out there and make plays there as well. And Bennett really last year with 29 touchdown passes and kind of the limited number of times that Georgia throws is an example of that. But for Bennett to take the next step of his career this year, you got to think, we got to throw even more touchdowns this year than you did a year ago, but you got to be careful that you don't add to your interception total too much when you do that. That it really kind of comes down to, hey, can I be the kind of quarterback that makes more plays, that trusts my ability, that's courageous on the field, that has that little bit of edge about me? Can I go out there and try to make plays without doing things that give the other team an opportunity? That's kind of what sort of hurt Trevor Lawrence at the beginning of his second season, returning as the starting quarterback who'd won a national championship. And ultimately, that's probably what cost Cardale Jones his job there at Ohio State. Now, here's what I'm guessing. That the Georgia coaches probably understand all of this very well, too. That experience alone doesn't make you better. It just makes you older. That you've got to evaluate that experience. You've got to use that experience to make yourself a better quarterback. And that's why it's good to have Todd Monken coming back for year 3. That's why it's good to have a collection of playmakers around Bennett that we believe can, in their own right, be breakout players and allow Bennett to kind of make the sort of big plays that kind of puts him in sort of that special category of guys who do build on a legacy 1 year after something really special happened for you. And Stetson Bennett, who's kind of always been pretty introspective and I think pretty thoughtful, I'm guessing he kind of gets this too, that he's not just here for Georgia for another season. He's here at Georgia for a reason. Like he wants to add to what's already a pretty magical story, but in Bennett's mind, maybe he's got a few chapters still left to write. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and we're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We start before that, 9:45, first and 15, at DawgNation.com and on the DawgNation app. And however you watch us on video, we're happy to have you do that. Or if you check us out on podcasts, you listen on demand, on the Apple Player, the Spotify Player, whatever podcast platform you enjoy, we're happy to have you with us for that. Or maybe it's the radio at noon each and every day, Monday through Friday, right there on Athens Sports Radio 960 Ref. We're happy to have you with us there for that as well. A lot of different ways for you to get in touch, and whichever one you choose, we're just happy about that. Also, big thanks to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for making it all possible. Had a lot of stormy weather here as of late. It's a reminder sometimes to us that Engineered Solutions of Georgia can really step up and help you if you've got that water intrusion in your house where it's not supposed to be. You're seeing wet spots in your basement, your crawl space, evidence of where water has been, or just water flowing through sometimes the basement. That's always a bad thing to see, but that's where our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia can step up for you. Or maybe yours is a different issue. Maybe you see those cracks in your wall. You know, the foundation represents the structural integrity of your home, and cracks in walls or cracks in sort of that basement floor or something like that can be a sign that things are not the way they're supposed to be. It's a problem. Well, guess what? Engineered Solutions of Georgia has the word solutions in their name. They're a solutions-based company ready to solve your problems. They got an entire team of engineers on their team to help you do just that. There's nobody else in our market that can say that the way that ESOG can, so trust them. They're proud partners of UGA. It's always great to support those that support the dogs. They're longtime friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily. So it's a great chance to get involved with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia and see all the great things they have in store for you. Easy phone number to dial there as well. You can simply give them a call, 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Make sure you check them out today. We're going to check out Connor Riley coming up in a couple of minutes too. That's going to be a lot of fun. Before that, though, I want to get ready to go around the doghouse, which is presented today by our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. Happy to have them with us back on the show here today as we get ready to talk some Georgia football. And I want to go back for a moment to something we talked about a little bit yesterday, which was the Georgia defense. And my belief that Nolan Smith kind of represents a little bit of a swing player, I would say, for the Georgia defense. We addressed this on yesterday's show, that if you look at the Georgia defense, what it brings back for the upcoming year, you see a guy like Jalen Carter along the defensive line that's about as close to a sure thing as it possibly could be. Carter's one of those guys that earned immense praise last season, even though he was playing in the shadow of Jordan Davis and a Devontae Wyatt and a Trayvon Walker, three guys along the defensive line with him who all went on to be number one picks last season. Carter was receiving no shortage of praise even last year. Gives you an idea of what he was capable of doing, the fact that he still stood tall even in the midst of a lot of defensive linemen having great seasons. So him coming back for this upcoming year is as big a luxury as any team in the country has, full stop, regardless of position. That's how valuable Carter is for UGA. And if that's true for Jalen, we would say that a guy like Keely Ringo is probably not too far behind on that. We talked about this yesterday. That if you were to have like an open draft of every college eligible player for this upcoming season, you would not go very far on that list before Keely Ringo was selected as maybe among the nation's top sort of lockdown style corners. A guy who obviously was a hero for Georgia in the national championship game, but really, played at a high level throughout the season, even though he was still relatively inexperienced for most of last year. Not a perfect player. No cornerback's ever going to pitch a perfect game and bat 1,000, but Ringo is a high value talent. And I would say if maybe a slight notch below Carter, something pretty close to a sure thing for the upcoming season there as well. And maybe just below that is a guy like Nolan Smith, who, while you see him frequently mentioned as a possible first-round pick for the upcoming season, he is probably not quite as unanimous a selection as Jalen Carter is and Keely Ringo is. That's what makes Nolan Smith a swing player. That if Nolan has just a good year, which he kind of already is a good player, and if he has just a good year, then maybe this is just a good Georgia defense, something that it typically is, and maybe that good Georgia defense propels a Georgia team that's also kind of just good. Maybe it is second best in the SEC, fifth best in the country, holiday weekend in New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl, but just below the college football playoff level. But if Nolan does what his high-end projection suggests is possible for him, then all of a sudden now he travels a similar path to guys like Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt, Trayvon Walker, who made themselves first-round picks because of the way they played in their final season there at UGA. And you heard me say a lot of this yesterday. Well, it's kind of a follow-up on this. I thought it was interesting that the Bednarik Award, this is the award that Jordan Davis won last season as the nation's top defensive player. There are two awards that kind of honor the nation's top defensive player, the Bednarik, one of those. That's what Davis won a year ago. And they put out their watch list yesterday. Now, listen, I realize watch lists are a little bit silly because you don't have to be on the watch list to win the award. I do realize that. But it was interesting to note that there were 3 Georgia guys that made the watch list. Ringo and Carter, as you would imagine, but Nolan Smith there as well. What if Nolan Smith gave you a Bednarik level performance this year? How good could the Georgia defense be? Like, how much better could the Georgia team be? A great year from Nolan Smith makes this a great defense, which makes Georgia, in turn, I believe, a great team. It is that simple for the Dogs here this season. Nolan Smith, one of the big swing players in this program on the field as they begin practice this week, and we have our eyes on him as that 2022 season opener looms against the Oregon Ducks. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia's own credit union. Of course, they've got you covered when it comes to those Visa Signature and Platinum cards, offering those contactless payments, super convenient, super easy to be a part of. You can also get flexible rewards there as well, which can be used for pretty much anything. Gift cards, cashback, travel, merchandise, so much more. You can also earn up to $150 when you open a new Platinum or Signature card. Of course, some restrictions do apply, so you're going to want to check out the website for more details on this. Georgia'sOwn.org. That's the word Georgia spelled all the way out. Georgia'sOwn.org. It's great to have Georgia's own credit union back with us for Around the Doghouse here today. It's also great to have Connor Riley on board there as well. There's a lot to do with Connor. We'll talk more about the Georgia defense as we've been discussing the last couple of days. I want to bring Connor into the Stetson Bennett discussion there as well about how he avoids maybe some of what other quarterbacks in a similar situation to him have maybe kind of dealt with, and kind of, what it's going to take to sort of be that guy for the Dogs here this season. Practice is getting ready to get going. There's also some recruiting stuff that's kind of floating out there too. So a lot to cover right now. Let us do it all. We call it a Kroger Fresh Take. It is Connor Riley here on the program today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Of course, Connor going to be very busy this week as Georgia begins its practices coming up later on. We'll hear from Kirby Smart, some of the Georgia players this week too, as they kind of offer their preview of the season, a little bit of an example of what their mindset looks like before they get going here for real in earnest. So that's going to be a good time. And Connor, good morning to you, and welcome back on the program here today. And do you get what I say when I call Nolan Smith a swing player? There's no doubt that Nolan's a good player. There's no doubt in my mind that he's a good player. I don't believe he's unlocked his full potential there at UGA, and I can't guarantee that he will. But if he does, I think it changes the postseason fortunes for Georgia here this season. And I'm not quite so sure there's anybody else in this roster I would say that's more true for than Nolan here this year. Where would you land on something like that?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with a movie comparison here. I think people that really watch and understand football, and certainly can do the same with Georgia, know that Nolan Smith is a good player. He's a little bit like the movie Everything Everywhere All the Time, which I think is one of the best movies I've seen this year. But obviously, it's sort of an indie favorite, hipster favorite, did not, get the, I think, sort of commercial appeal that, say, some of the blockbusters that you have seen out there be. If Nolan Smith turns into Top Gun Maverick and has that kind of a year where everyone in the country knows he is, no doubt about it, a good player, I do think that raises the ceiling of this defense, because, if he's a guy racking up, doing all-around excellence like he does and getting the sack numbers 7.5, 8, maybe even 9, when you factor in with Robert Beal is going to give off the edge there as well on the other side, who I think is perhaps maybe a better pure pass rusher than what Nolan Smith is, you see the path to 40 sacks, which is the number we've so often thrown around on here. And so with that in mind, if you're getting elite production from Jalen Carter, you're getting elite production from Nolan Smith, I don't think you have some of the questions about replacing what Nakobe Dean gave you a season ago, replacing what Channing Tindall gave you, replacing what some of those very statistically productive players in that front seven gave you a season ago.
Yeah, I want to say this, and I hope I'm not incorrect in what I'm saying here, but I feel this is probably true. Like, we saw last year how valuable it is for Georgia to have a great defensive line. But if you told me, as someone who cheers for Georgia, hey, BA, you can have your wish of sort of an all-American level player at any position this year, 5 years from now, 15 years from now, if you give me my choice of having sort of an all-American Bednarik award-winning level player at any position, I would choose outside linebacker. I would choose edge rusher, because the job that the edge rusher primarily does is the most valuable commodity on that side of the ball. No disrespect to good defensive line. It's great to take away the run. And no disrespect to cornerback play, defensive back play. It's great to defend passes and make things tough when the ball is in the air. But the most valuable commodity on the defensive side is getting after the quarterback. If you told me I could have a great edge rusher, in Georgia's case, we'll just call him an outside linebacker. If you told me I could have that guy in any year, that's the best place to have a great player, I believe, on the defensive side of the football.
Now, normally I'd be inclined to agree with you, and if like the defensive lineman you're throwing out there is, what we saw from Trayvon Walker last year or Jordan Davis last year as well, undeniably great players. But if that defensive lineman is, say, Jalen Carter, and he's a player I believe is capable of getting 10 sacks the way that he plays and the way that I think he is best optimized and used, I think I take him as that sort of player because, and maybe this is the former offensive lineman in me, but when you are just getting blown up the middle on every play, or that is the potential of what could happen, it makes it so much worse for the rest of your offense there. And so, with Nolan Smith, there are some things you can do to maybe if he is productive, and you saw Georgia do this in the national championship game against Will Anderson in terms of rolling away from him, having a tight end and a running back in there to help the offensive tackle there as well. When a defensive tackle like Jalen Carter is just beating you up the middle time and time again, there's not a whole lot you can do. Similar to Aaron Donald at the NFL level, I think some of my favorite things from him, it's not so much to see his impact, him getting to the quarterback, which he obviously does very well, but it's the screenshots that you see where he's got like 4 offensive linemen on him, and every single other Rams defender is essentially singled up. I think Jalen Carter could potentially have that kind of an impact, but your point there is correct there as well. You look at the other two clear best teams in the college football playoff last year, Alabama and Michigan, no disrespect to Cincinnati, but the best defensive players on those two teams were edge rushers. And conversely, those edge rushers, Will Anderson and Aiden Hutchinson, were so good that they freed up things for Dallas Turner and for David Ojabo to be impact players there as well. And I think if Jalen Carter has the season I think he's capable of having, I think he can do the same thing for Georgia this year.
Is there anybody else that you kind of put in that category of swing guy for the Dogs in terms of he's got to have greatness as a ceiling? Not good. He's got to have greatness as a ceiling, and he's got to have some sort of meat left on the bone, and he kind of hasn't gotten there yet. Like who else would sort of meet the category of swing player as I'm defining? I feel like I've got at least one name on that. Do you have another kind of swing player that could change the fortune of the season for UGA?
I'll give you one offense and one defense,
okay,
and I'll start on the defensive side of the ball here. I'm going to go Chris Smith, a guy who has just consistently gotten better every time he's seen the field. And, because he wasn't the megastar recruit, because I believe this is his 5th year back at UGA, he doesn't necessarily have some of the recognition that, say, 5-star Jalen Carter, 5-star Keely Ringo, 5-star Nolan Smith has. But, he had an interception in the national championship game last year against Alabama. He had an interception returned for a touchdown in the big game against Clemson. He's a guy that has shown that he's had the ability to make plays this year, and given with Lewis Cine moving on to the next level, I do think he is a safety that has shown some playmaking ability, and with a greater opportunity in this Georgia defense to do so, I think he's got a chance to showcase that, and if he does that, I think the talent is there for him to be one of the better safeties in America, something Georgia has always pretty much consistently had under Kirby Smart.
Can I stop you before you mention your next name? Can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. So, and I want to hear your offensive name too, but I don't want to lose track of this. So if you look at Georgia under Kirby Smart, like their track record at safety is remarkable. Obviously we know what Lewis Cine was, became first-round pick. We know what Richard LeCount was. Barring injury, he would have been a much higher draft pick, but his value to Georgia was well established.
He was one of the best defensive players in the country his last year before that injury.
Completely. People kind of forget J.R. Reed was a first-team AP All-American, and he was like a sort of a transfer that came to Georgia with a little fanfare and became a first-team All-American, playing safety. Do you think Christopher Smith belongs in that same lineage? Could Smith have sort of like typical Georgia safety year? Is he good enough to be in that lineage?
I absolutely think so. You think J.R. Reed even, I think that's maybe a template that he could follow. J.R. made the iconic interception in the home game against Notre Dame where he's sliding in out of nowhere to pick off a pass there that day from Ian Book. I think you've seen Chris Smith has the ability to make those plays. Obviously, the touchdown against Clemson comes to mind, and even the interception last year against Alabama. He's, to me, shown enough playmaking ability already. I think he has the potential to do that. As far as the offensive name that I'm going to go with here, and we've talked about him before, I think it's Kearis Jackson. This is a guy I get a feeling I'm probably a good bit higher on than a number of other people on the beat. But I was really, really impressed with what I saw out of him in the spring game this year. And if you're telling me that you're getting that Kearis Jackson to be healthy for all 15 games, I believe you have a dynamic difference maker at that wide receiver position. He looked noticeably faster than we had seen him really at any point in the 2021 season, and probably even the 2020 season as well. And, he himself, 2018 signee, he's basically a man at this point. And so I think when you factor that in as well, I've said I think Kearis is going to lead this team in receiving this year. If he does that, I think he's going to need to get to 850, 900 yards receiving, and that's sort of the number you've thrown out there as well. And if he's doing that and getting those types of numbers, in addition to what we expect from these Georgia tight ends this year, that's an AP first-team All-SEC type wide receiver potentially, or at least certainly a guy that's going to get mentioned on there. And so I do think that do not forget about Kearis Jackson. As much talent as there is in that pass-catching core for Georgia this year, I think he is a guy, because of the injury, and specifically the injury he had when it happened last year, never really allowed him to get going. I think he's absolutely a guy that can make a difference for Georgia this year.
If you are right about this, you have every opportunity on this show to spike the football as much as you want to, because you're the only one that I know that's saying, at any given moment, there are 8 million people saying everything about Georgia football literally all the time. You're the only one I know who's this high on Kearis Jackson. And I don't mean that as a disrespect to Kearis, because I think there's a lot to like about Kearis Jackson. But my honest assessment of this and why your statement is so eyebrow-raising to me is I just don't know if the ceiling for Kearis is high enough for me to put him in the category of what I'm thinking of as the swing player. To me, to be the swing player, you've got to have a ceiling that's like first-round pick. And that's why, for me, my offensive guy might be more like an Eric Gilbert more so than a Kearis Jackson. And listen, I think Kearis is a great player. I think he's tough as nails. I think he's going to have some big moments for Georgia this year, almost certainly. But the one thing that you seem to think is true, and as a Georgia fan, I hope you're right and I hope I'm wrong, but the thing that you seem to think is true is you seem to see a higher ceiling there than maybe I'm sure that exists with Jackson, which I think is a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, and maybe this is just me putting too much into that spring game performance there. And, I do think you're correct in your assumption about Kearis Jackson. I don't think is going to be a first-round pick just because of his size measurables. But this is a guy who, one, he's already led Georgia in receiving once before. And we have a DawgNation poll on the side on our site right now. You can vote. It changes every week and things like that. And one of the early ones was, who's going to lead Georgia in receiving this year? Somehow Kearis Jackson was not even an option on that.
How about that?
And I think just he's a veteran. It's his third year in the offense. He's healthy now. I think he has taken full advantage of that Georgia strength and conditioning program, with it being his 5th year in this program. I think he is a guy who knows the ins and outs of this league and knows also how to get open and make big plays. We've seen before he has a good rapport with Stetson Bennett. And I think when you add all that in there, he's a guy who I think a lot of Georgia fans can probably see a good season from Kearis Jackson. I think if you're telling me Kearis Jackson gives you, say, 850 yards versus 500 yards, I think that makes a pretty substantial difference in what the ultimate long-term ceiling of this Georgia offense is as a whole.
At the risk of going too long on this, it kind of dovetails something else I've talked about a good bit, which is the high water mark for a wide receiver in the Kirby Smart era has been 727 yards. Great talent pickings and a deficient offense in 2019. To me, it's really interesting to see, can a very proficient offense led by Todd Monken take what might be a lesser talent than Pickens and get a better year out of him? To me, that speaks to the value of a good coaching system, which I do believe Georgia has when it comes to Todd Monken.
Yeah, and I think there's a really good chance that's what you see this year, because there are just so many other options on this Georgia offense in 2022 than there was in that 2019 offense.
As I mentioned before you joined us, Stetson Bennett kind of becomes the third quarterback in the playoff era to have started in a national championship year and then come back the following year as the reigning national champion. And it wasn't necessarily storybook years for either of the two guys who did that before. Trevor Lawrence finished like 7th in the Heisman voting in 2019, and based on where he started the year, by his own standard, that's a little bit of a disappointment. And Cardale Jones just outright lost his job at Ohio State after becoming a hero, stepping in as the third-team quarterback to win the national championship for the Buckeyes for the first time in kind of a long time. How does Stetson Bennett avoid that in his own attempt to return after a magical year here in 2022?
I mean, obviously, I think the big thing to start off there is just limit the turnovers, and he can have them because he's shown he's a good enough playmaker to make up for them. The number I go back to is 10. If he's going to start 15 games for you, 14 games from you, you told me you get 10 interceptions total out of Stetson Bennett this year. I think you take that because we've seen from him before with his playmaking ability, both against mediocre defenses that he's shown he can feast on, and even in the last half of that national championship game, he's shown an ability to make plays. If you're telling me you get 10 interceptions out of Stetson Bennett this year total and over the course of a 14-game season, you're probably going to see 35 touchdowns, maybe even potentially 40, depending on how proficient this offense ends up being. He had 29 touchdowns last year and I believe 12 starts, so I think there's reasonable expectations with the step back that you expect from this defense that he's capable of getting to that 35, potentially even a 40 touchdown mark there. And 40 and 10 might be a bit unrealistic here, but it's not out of the question for him to get to a 35 touchdown season. And if he's doing that and he's limiting the turnovers and he's running a good offense, I absolutely think that eventually maybe you start to change some perception. Obviously, there are fans out there that he's just never going to be good enough for, and he knows this, and he's not exactly hiding from that, knows that he's never going to win over those people. He could beat Bama again, and people are still going to be, you've lost to him twice, you've won against him twice, what are we really going to get? And so I think Stetson has shown you that, at the very least, he's a good enough quarterback to win a national championship. There is not that question this year with Georgia was, do they have the quarterback to win the national title? I absolutely believe with Stetson Bennett they do. How much further can Stetson go about elevating his game? Can he get to that 35 touchdown mark? Because that is something Jake Fromm never did.
Yeah.
And so if he does that and elevates this offense and gets it to that 42-point-a-game mark where it's unquestionably a top 5 offense, I think that's something he can certainly do, and it's going to change the way people saw him. And let's not forget, Aaron Murray entering his last year, there were a lot of questions about him. Well, can he win the big game? Can he do this? Can he lead the team? And while that 2013 Georgia team only went 8-5, and his year ended a little unceremoniously after tearing his ACL against Kentucky, Aaron Murray answered so many questions with his leadership and the way he played throughout the course of the season. It wouldn't surprise me to see Stetson Bennett do something similar this season.
I think that's really interesting. Let me move on to something else just because for the sake of time here. I'm going to ask the same question I asked you last week. Do you think the 2023 recruiting cycle is going well for Georgia?
The English snob in me would say it is going good. I do not think it was necessarily going well. But I think part of that, it's not so much what Georgia is doing. It's just in juxtaposition to what Alabama has done. I don't think losing Caleb Downs, especially when you have Janelle Aguero, is as bad, except for the fact that he's going to Alabama, who's pretty clearly your biggest on-field rival right now in terms of competition. And so it is probably a little frustrating, and understandably so, for Georgia to win a national title and to see not necessarily Georgia get the recruiting bump, though they are still recruiting very well, I would point out, but for Alabama to just raise its level once again and go out and land 3 of the top 4 players in the state of Georgia to, by far, I think, have the number 1 recruiting class as it stands here right now on Tuesday, August 2nd. And still, because of the talent in the state of Alabama this year, James Smith and Quay Rushsaw have potential to add to that there as well. Georgia, also after the national title, I think there are still some of those same lingering concerns. Are they going to be able to land an elite wide receiver? And now it's probably even bleeding into the skill position players with Justice Haynes' decision. I'm not quite ready to go there yet at running back. I've given Del McGee the benefit of the doubt before, and I'd point out, you look back at, say, the 2019 cycle, John Emery Jr. ends up decommitting from Georgia, flipping to LSU. Georgia goes out and lands Kenny McIntosh. I don't think there's a person in the country that would take, certainly to this point, John Emery Jr.'s career over Kenny McIntosh's. And even going into this year, I think money would still take Kenny McIntosh and what he's going to be able to do. So while Del McGee didn't land the recruit that he necessarily wanted to at the top of his board this year, he's still got an incredible eye for talent, and I think is going to be someone that's going to answer some of those questions. But to go back and circle back to your first question, it's going good. They're the number 3 or number 4 ranked recruiting class as it stands right now. I think the reason that there's maybe some salty guilty feelings is because Alabama is just so clearly up their game and recruiting so incredibly well on the recruiting trail right now.
I think my response to all this is because, like you said, you can make a long list of wins that Georgia's collected, and these are all really valuable commodities for future Georgia teams. No one can dispute that. You can also make a list of decisions that have been disappointing for UJ fans there as well. I think across the board, whether it be Georgia, whether it be Alabama, whether it really be anybody, I think it's too early to start writing very many narratives about exactly what is going on in the 2023 class. You and I have talked frequently about A&M relatively dormant, but that kind of changed last weekend. Florida at one point in time was a little bit of a laughing stock, and they've seemingly found a little bit of life among them. And some of that may be coming at the expense of Ohio State, who at one point in time was kind of riding high. Maybe Miami's been, for the most part, kind of a clear winner, but Janelle Aguero didn't go there. That we see a lot of what might even be contradictory information kind of unfolding here for the 2023 cycle. And I think for Georgia, and almost maybe for everybody else there as well, it may be for now just a little too early to know what's going on really anywhere, and very difficult to predict how all this is going to change because, clearly, president of transfer portal and most prominently the president of NIL is making the nature of these decisions just different than they've been in the past.
Yeah, and it seems like right now we've seen a lot more commitments early on in a cycle. Now, granted, it had been trending that way since the early signing day had been instituted, but it's pretty rare for Georgia to be close to 20 commitments, Alabama close to be 20 commitments at this time, just given how important Kirby Smart values that senior year in terms of development from a high school ranks. And so I do think that, as you point out, there's still a lot of twists and turns that are gonna take place over the course of this recruiting cycle. Obviously, I think the role that games win-loss results have on a recruit are maybe perhaps overstated. But I do think for some of the guys that are still undecided out there, let's say Georgia, specifically with James Smith and Q Russell, I think two of the more important players in this class.
Yeah.
Let's say this Georgia defense goes out and is a top 10, maybe even a top 5 defense over the course of the entire season this year. That probably makes you feel a lot better about what you were potentially stepping into there at Georgia in terms of their ability to develop year in, year out and continuously put guys into the pros. Because if that's the case, it's not just Nolan Smith and Jalen Carter we're talking about as pros, but it's guys like Jamon Dumas-Johnson who are rising up draft boards, though obviously he's not draft eligible this year. It's guys like Zion Logue, who many people hadn't probably thought much of prior to last year, and maybe he looks like an NFL defensive lineman. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins is a guy that I think is going to make a jump this year. Chris Smith, we've talked about him earlier. So I think if this Georgia defense takes the developmental steps forward, I think you're going to see that there. And I think you and I both expect when it comes to the offensive side of the football, look, Georgia's going to put up points this year. They're going to do the things that you would think offensive recruits would like to see. Now, they still have to go out there and close, and I do trust in what Brian McClendon's going to be able to do at that wide receiver position. And so if we see the results that we need to see, I do think that this Georgia recruiting momentum, whatever it needs to be, is going to turn pretty quickly here in the final weeks of this, or final months really, of the 2023 recruiting cycle.
I want to ask you about Georgia's season opener against Oregon coming up in a moment. Before that, though, let me kind of remind folks about a couple of really cool things that Kroger has going on right now when it comes to kids. First of all, one of those things is Kroger Chef Jr. This is a really, really fun thing right now. It's back, and there's a great couple of opportunities for you to experience this in the month of August, whether it be August 13th or the 27th at select Kroger locations, getting a chance to make a fruit pizza. It's a healthy food option. To me, it's easier to get kids to eat healthy food when they're kind of involved in making it. It's kind of a fun thing to be a part of. And so a great fruit pizza recipe, you can make that this month at Kroger on the 13th and the 27th as a part of the Kroger Chef Junior program. It's a 30-minute class, and every time you sign up, that means it's $7 per kid that signs up. You'll receive an apron and a patch, a chef's hat, a recipe card, and a box, and, of course, a pizza cutter there as well. So it's a really fun thing to be able to do. Make some fruit pizza, enjoy some good food, learn how to make it courtesy of our friends at Kroger, KrogerChefJunior.com for more details on that. That's spelled Junior, Junior. Kroger Chef Jr. for that. Also, speaking of kids in Kroger, we're in the midst right now of honoring our Kroger 5-star kid winners. We had a great winner announced yesterday. We get a chance to announce a great one here today. And congratulations to everybody who submitted terrific stories. We've loved celebrating all those with you, but we want to announce Rachel Young as our winner here today. So congratulations to Rachel. I want to tell you a little bit about her. She's in advanced classes there at Matt Arthur Elementary School, going into 4th grade this upcoming week, and got a whole lot of fun things going on there at school. She's also a gymnastics athlete, and she's involved in theater there as well. Does some great things. Even been a part of a presentation of the Christmas Carol, the great Charles Dickens story. So she's done a lot of that kind of stuff. She's super involved in her church there at Central Baptist Church there too, doing some unbelievable things. Got a bunch of siblings that she's doing cool stuff for there as well. So she's a terrific Kroger 5-star kid winner. Congratulations to Rachel Young on that. If you're watching on video, you certainly see a beautiful picture of her. Just an example of some of the terrific kids and some of the special families who are in our audience. And we love celebrating them as we kind of go back to school here this week. And, of course, as you're thinking about your own back-to-school opportunities, our friends at Kroger got you covered on all of that. So check out your local Kroger for all your back-to-school needs, even some of that last-minute stuff that you didn't know you needed but kind of pops up as a need. You can check all of that out there at Kroger. All right, Connor, we've gone way long here, so let me give you a quick chance to kind of sum all this up. You had a chance to kind of listen in on Dan Lanning at Pac-12 Media Days the other day. I think one of the topics we have not probably given full consideration for with the Ducks is the fact that, Bo Nix, the transfer from Auburn, seems like he might be getting a little bit of a push from Ty Thompson. Thompson, another quarterback on that roster, has earned a good bit of praise thus far this offseason. How much lip service did Lanning give to Thompson, maybe making a push with Nix there? And is there anything else you learned about Georgia's first game from listening to a guy that Georgia fans know well, Lanning, at Pac-12 Media Days the other day?
Yeah, I think Dan Lanning is taking all the pages out of Kirby Smart's playbook when it comes to press conferences, because I heard a lot of the same things that you would hear Kirby Smart potentially say, specifically when it comes to that quarterback battle. He made sure not just to single out Bo Nix or Ty Thompson when asked. He also included Jay Butterfield in there and mentioned all three as possible quarterback options here for Oregon in that first game to open the season against Georgia. And so, he's going to play things close to the vest. He's not going to really speak in a whole lot of specifics and speak in more general statements there. And so I think there's somewhat of an unknown there going into that first game. I will note, because I think the familiarity you have with Bo Nix and Kenny Dillingham, I think you maybe see Bo Nix to start the season, and we'll see how that first game goes. It wouldn't surprise me to see both quarterbacks there, but given that both sort of, obviously I think Nix is the better athlete because there are just very few athletes as good as Bo Nix at that quarterback position. We could possibly see multiple quarterbacks there for Oregon that day, but Dan Lanning's never going to come out and say that right away. And, while he and Kirby Smart, I think, are very respectful of each other, they're not talking about game plans and what each other are going to do. And both, I think, as competitive as they are going to look to go out there and get a win to start the season right in 2022, because I think both of them legitimately believe they have teams that are good enough to contend for the college football playoff this year. Short question, and feel free to give a short answer as we wrap up. I see Oregon as a top 20 level team this upcoming season. I really don't have them in my top 10. Do you agree with that? I do not agree with that. They are not a top 10 as far as what they are at the end of the year. Yeah, that's what I think we are in agreement then. I see them as top 20, but not top 10. So I think we are in agreement. That's the indication the interview's gone too long. But good stuff, Connor. We'll look forward to reading a bunch more from you there at DawgNation.com. Practice this week. Lots of coverage. Can't wait for all of that then. Yep, BA, as always, was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through. All
right, fun stuff there. And as I said before, as you head towards the end of the week, we had a bunch of coverage coming from Athens there. August 4th, it gets going just a couple days from right now. So we'll hear from Kirby Smart. We'll hear from some Georgia players. You'll start to get some of those practice reports. You'll get a lot of what's going down with the Dogs right here at DawgNation.com. And man, oh man, are we excited about all of that. Something else I'm really excited about there as well is a big sale going on with our friends at Royal Caribbean right now. This is another opportunity for you to take advantage of what I tell you about all the time, that a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation is a great thing for you and those that you love, friends, family, everything else. And the big savings that are available for you right now, another reason for you to be a part of this. Because for this week only, you got 30% off those who are sailing, and you got kids sail free. What a great chance to get your entire family on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship with that kids sail free option, plus 30% off all cruisers there as well. Some huge options, some huge ways to make your Royal Caribbean cruise vacation even more cost effective at a time right now when just seems like a lot of things are more expensive. To hear something that's on sale, to hear something that's less than it was before, that's big news, especially when it's something as much fun as a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation is. So you've heard about me tell you about it for a long time now. Go ahead and take the step to get your own Royal Caribbean cruise going. Our friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority can help you out with that. You can find them online, tcava.com. That's their website, tcava.com. You can also give them a call, 770-952-8300. That's 952-8300. Royal Caribbean's got you covered on that. Our friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority can get you booked up and ready to go. It's a great time to be on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. Also a great time for us right now to go cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And I mentioned a moment ago, a handful of Georgia players showing up on the list of Bednarik Award watch list, folks. And once again, the reminder, I gave this to you earlier, I'll say it again. You don't have to be on the watch list to win any of these awards. Everybody's eligible for the award, whether you're on the watch list or not. The watch lists, I guess, are just sort of for PR and attention, whatnot. But there are a handful of SEC names I do want you to be aware of on the lookout here for Defensive Player of the Year in college football, which is the Bednarik Award, what it kind of goes to. And you talk about, what can change the fortunes for a team. If one of these guys were to step up and play at that level, obviously, I mean, we said this about Nolan Smith in Georgia, but you'd say the same about Jalen Carter or Akili Ringo. Everything feels different if you get that kind of individual performance from one of your key defenders. For Alabama, they got a handful of guys in there like Will Anderson or Jordan Battle or Henry To'oTo'o. Maybe include Dallas Turner there on that list, who is not really on the watch list, but probably at least in consideration. You've heard Anderson say that he thinks that Dallas Turner is every bit as good as he is. Think about a guy like Bumper Poole, the linebacker at Arkansas. He gets a lot of attention because he has kind of a funny, cool name, I guess. But he's much more than that as a player. And for a Hogs team that not only plays a tough schedule, but is a tough out on a lot of other people's schedule there as well, to get a massive year from a guy like Poole could completely change, the entirety of a season. We've said before that Florida's a little bit like this too, that you got a guy like Brenton Cox who's on this list, but for me it's probably more like a Javon Dexter, who's, I guess, for whatever reason, not on the list. But I think that Dexter's probably the better player in comparison to Cox. What if you get the big season from a Dexter or a Brenton Cox as a pass rusher? How much better that makes the outlook for Florida, playing a lot of swing games early in the year. Utah, Kentucky, to a degree Tennessee, although we think that Tennessee probably handles them. LSU's a little bit of a swing game for the Gators. If you've got a superstar level player on your defense, all of a sudden a lot of those swing games become a little bit easier to win. B.J. Ojulari at LSU is a little bit like this. The LSU roster overall is still pretty talented, but sometimes when you watch them play the last couple of years, you've been left to wonder, well, where is all that talent? In some cases, it was just sort of injured or opted out. But in other cases, it's maybe guys playing below their level. What if B.J. Ojulari has an Azeez Ojulari level year for the Tigers? How much easier does that make Brian Kelly's transition into the SEC? And on you could go with more of these discussions, but that's what can be kind of fun about the watch list. You start to think about, well, what if this guy really does play at that level? How much different does it make, the team that he plays on? And it's not just Georgia for whom that's true. You potentially have that being true for a lot of these teams there as well. Quick shout out here. Good news for one SEC team in the state of Georgia yesterday. Grant Godfrey, linebacker at North Gwinnett, the son of Randall Godfrey, was a terrific player for Georgia back in the early 90s. His son, Grant, makes a commitment there to the University of Kentucky. So an example of what Mark Stoops has probably gotten more of than previous Kentucky coaches had any right to ever dream of, which are some high value recruiting additions. Godfrey, an example of that for Stoops, and also for Randall Godfrey, who a lot of Georgia fans really remember during his time in Georgia. His son Grant, a terrific linebacker. Georgia certainly had, I think, a lot of priorities that was trying to deal with the linebacker position. It was a very crowded position this year. I think if you're a Georgia fan, you feel great about the linebackers that Georgia got, and you wish Grant Godfrey well as he moves on to Kentucky, living into a pretty prominent last name there. Obviously, Randall Godfrey, really one of the all-time greats when it comes to high school football in Georgia, and did some great things there at his time at UGA. And now his son, a very good player, too, for a terrific North Gwinnett program, on his way to Kentucky. Finally, for our cruiser in the SEC, I want to mention this. I think it's an interesting story, and it just kind of popped up not too long ago, within the last couple of hours as I'm recording this, at ESPN.com. It's the 11 biggest power brokers and the advocates shaping the future of college football. This is one of those things that I think that we need to probably spend more time talking about. And sometimes it's sort of hard to do this because it's not as much fun as talking about the game on the field, and I get that. We like to make things fun around here when we certainly have the chance to do that. But when you think about the future of college football, the word power, which exists in this headline, is really as important as anything else. In fact, sometimes I think all the talk about money sort of obscures what's really going on here. That there's obviously a huge chase right now with the expanded SEC, the expanded Big Ten, to get as much money as you can get. and there's major concern with the Pac-12 and the Big 12 and the ACC, including sort of a fancier phrase than I should use, existential crisis about whether or not they can even make enough money to survive, and that's all probably pretty real. But I think the discussion around money, the pursuit of money, and all the fixation with money, I think obscures the fact that the next 5 years around college football, 10 years maybe, but certainly the next few years, it's going to be behind the scenes about the pursuit of power, I believe, even more so than the pursuit of money. There's enough money to go around, but power is always a more scarce resource. And in the very near future, someone else is going to be in control of college football. The NCAA has never really had any real say over college football, not in my lifetime and a long time prior to that. But it's very easy to conceive that within the next few years, even in like name only, even in like sort of like loose connection, the NCAA is not involved in this at all anymore. Well, what happens then? Who's in charge of college football, or who shares the power of college football? You can easily imagine Greg Sankey wants a hand in that, and there are plenty of SEC fans who hope he has a larger say in where the sport goes. Kevin Warren from the Big Ten probably wants to try to do the same thing there as well, and make no mistake about it, Warren and the presidents he serves has quite a stark difference, a competing vision, if you will, in comparison to what, like, say, Greg Sankey and the presidents that he serves, what they might want for the future of college athletics to be. These are differences that matter. They are differences that make a distinction. And it is a power battle that's going to go on. And there are other players who are kind of involved in some of this too. But, in some cases, it's sort of like too in the weeds to be too hot of a topic for what we do around here. But in the future of college athletics, it won't all just be the pursuit of money. Some of it's going to be the pursuit of power. Who gets to make the decisions? Who gets to tell people what to do? That's what college sports is about to be about in the next few years, and ESPN kind of out on the forefront of all that right now. They're at ESPN.com. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And speaking of power, everybody wants to kind of empower themselves to have a better life, and one of the ways in which you do that is through college education. But here's the thing that as you get ready to start college, many of you, or you have kids who are kind of starting college, sometimes finding a way to pay for it all can be a really difficult thing to do, and maybe have some last-minute opportunities where things need to be paid for. That's where I want you to know about my friends at College Ave, because they've got some great last-minute opportunities to get some help for you getting those college expenses paid for. You can get private student loans from College Ave Student Loans. They can cover the full cost of college. So if you've got some stuff left over that hasn't gotten quite paid for yet, College Ave can sort of step up with you and do all of that, and taking some of the stress out of your sort of college experience or your child's college experience by creating a private student loan that suits your budget, fits your goals, just a better quality of life, and sort of being able to breathe a little bit easier with convenient payback plans and things like that. They can take care of all that business for you. So they got competitive interest rates, got flexible repayment plans, and they got great customer service. That's a big reason why you want to reach out to my friends at College Ave right now. It's a stress-free 3-minute application, really easy to do. Just go to College Ave, that's AVE, collegeave.com for a lot more on that. That's collegeave.com, spelled AVE, for a lot more on that. Check them out today. All right, earlier we talked about great Royal Caribbean cruise vacations. And as we close out our show with our golden shoe, we'll show a couple of folks having a good time on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation and making us jealous and making us wish we were there. Georgia expat shared this with me. It's Pierce Outlaw on Twitter. Something that he calls himself Ryan Elite National Champion said on Twitter. He said, "It's a good morning aboard, Mariner of the Seas with Royal Caribbean." So he's right there in the Playmaker Sports Bar. I recognize that very well from my own Royal Caribbean cruises in the past. Watching Georgia winning the national championship game from the sports bar there, Playmaker Sports Bar and Grill. Ryan having himself a good time. Georgia expat sharing that with me. So we'll give golden shoes to both of them. But wait, that's not all. Another great golden shoe winner enjoying herself on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation as well. Rob Phillips sharing his mom showing off that Georgia G up in Alaska. How much do you love to see that? Rob, thanks for sharing that. Golden shoes to you all there as well. And, of course, lousy, stinking Gators, they have no national championships to celebrate, and they're taking no cruise vacations right now either. They're just sitting around and drowning in their sorrows. 4,954 days since they have won a national championship. But guess what? The news gets no better, because 88 days from right now, Dogs back in Jacksonville, beating up on those lousy, stinking Gators again. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We will see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And on video, time now for our R.S. Andrews cooldown. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that today. We'll take your comments here and invite you to get your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs with our friends at R.S. Andrews. They got you on all of that, so you can do that with them. Let me go to YouTube and start on YouTube here today and see how the folks are doing over there. And as I said before, we're really only like 2 days away from like Georgia practices beginning in earnest. That is awesome, awesome, awesome. Jay Shipe says it's been 182 hours since that YouTube start. Well, guess what, Jay? You can scratch that off and go back to zero, because here we are. And Christy is there to tell you all about that. Jonathan Aaron says, who in your eyes will be wide receiver 1? Oh, well, Connor Riley a moment ago made a compelling case for Karis Jackson, but in terms of the receiver, the wide receiver who I expect to have the most receiving yards for Georgia, my guy on that is A.D. Mitchell right now. And you know how like the recruiting people now these days, it's no longer just the online prediction. You now have to also give a confidence level. So my prediction is Mitchell. My confidence level is low. That's my answer to that question. Mitchell with a very low confidence level. Not because I'm not confident in Mitchell. I think he's a fine player. It's just that I think, there are a number of guys that it could be, but by a slight margin, I'll probably take 80 there in that discussion, but a relatively low confidence level overall. Hugh Nash says if you did any more cruises, your show handle would have to be Captain Stubb. Yeah, we got a couple coming up, one in December, one in February, so I'm excited about it. I'm excited. I love it. Listen, I like to kind of punctuate my football seasons with cruise vacations. I just kind of enjoy that. It's a great way to kind of get the most out of life, I think. Frank Batterson brings up a pretty good point. We have not mentioned this yet, but it is a fact. And I believe our buddy Rusty Manziel may have had this, or at least that's the person I saw from it first, that Oregon doesn't start classes until much later. So they have no 20-hour work week. And Georgia does. That would seem to be a disadvantage. Now, are there ways? Honestly, I just don't know. Are there ways around that or something like that? I don't know. Obviously, Georgia's going to follow the rules to the letter. We certainly understand that. And the fact that Oregon doesn't have to do that, that seems to be a little bit of an advantage. I'd say it probably is. It's also one of those things, like when I was in college, we were on the quarter system. Like I didn't go to UGA. A lot of you know this. But when I was in school back in the 90s, graduated in 99, we were on the quarter system, and I really liked it. We didn't start school until late September. I remember we used to almost always start college the week of the Tennessee-Florida game. I don't know why I always remember that, but that was always kind of like the time in which my college classes began, the week that Tennessee played Florida. That was around the time that the quarter system started. And we went to semester system. They wanted the semester to finish prior to Christmas, so therefore you started earlier so you could be done in December. You took classes for a long period of time. It's probably 6 of one, half dozen of another. But I always liked the quarter system because to me, you had one class for 10 weeks. I don't care how bad the class was. You only had to endure it for 10 weeks. It was just over. I was a big fan of the quarter system. I think I may be wrong about this because, I am just, I am not an academician by any stretch of the imagination, but I think Tech may have stayed on the quarter system well after a lot of other places didn't, but I may be wrong about that. But I think I might be right. Phoneme Unit checking in. Always glad to see him. Thomas Tyson, the subject of Ohio State's defense. Yeah, here's the thing. It's like we're obviously a Georgia show for Georgia fans, and the last few years, this show has taken on a very decidedly pro-Georgia bent because Georgia's doing really well. It's very easy to have a pro-Georgia conversation when the team is doing really well. And frankly, if you weren't having a pro-Georgia conversation, you'd just be being disingenuous because things are going well. Now, the cynical people would say, well, if you're just being too pro any one team, the phrase that they call for that's like a sunshine pump. You're just pumping sunshine. Well, I can guarantee you this. There is no greater sunshine being pumped right now. And that may end up being true, but in terms of grasping for very little in the way of evidence. The idea that Ryan Day goes to Big Ten Media Days of the day and says, new defense coordinator Jim Knowles, we expect him to have us in the top 10 by the time the season's done. This defense was barely in the top 40 a year ago. Somehow Jim Knowles is going to pack a magic wand in his travel bag and wave that thing and turn Ohio State into a top 10 defense. Maybe it happens. It's not impossible. But, certainly that's a much larger degree of sunshine than you're going to typically hear pumped on a show like this, I would think, because hopefully the things that we say have a little more evidence to support them than that. Let's see what else. Danny Blackman, good to see you checking in. Appreciate that. Jay Shipe says, did I miss the A&M updater today? Jay, you're the only one that's always talking about A&M. I mean, and the whole comment section knows this. The people that are here on a regular basis, they have sniffed this out, and they know I'm right. I'm not the one who talks about A&M every day. You're the one who talks about A&M every day, and everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. Chase White says, do you think our DBs will hold their own against Tennessee in a man situation? I do. A couple of thoughts on that there as well, which is, and I can't remember if I said this off the air last week or on the air, but I think it's really weird that when Darian Kendrick transferred to Georgia, we made a very big deal about this, a huge topic. Everybody was kind of discussing how good he could maybe be. And then he got here, and he played at a pretty high level, right? I mean, he wasn't a huge draft pick, but he was just solid as a rock at a starting cornerback position for UGA. And it's almost like once he got on the field, people sort of stopped talking about him. And I think that quietly he's actually a pretty difficult player for Georgia to replace this year. I believe that's the case. So your question about the Georgia defensive backs holding their own against the Tennessee wide receivers, that's part of that for me, is that Kendrick's actually a relatively tough guy to replace, I believe. And one more point I'll make, but Connor Riley wants to chime back in.
Would note the early reviews in Darian Kendrick coming out of Rams camp have been very, very encouraging.
All right, there you go. That's good to hear. I'm very, very happy to hear that. We've seen some Georgia players make a name for themselves in training camps seemingly already this year. So Kendrick being one of them, that's nice to know, and a very nice update to get from Connor Riley. So the point is the answer is yes. I do believe that the Georgia defensive backs can hold their own against the Tennessee wide receivers, probably the best crop of receivers that Georgia will play in the regular season. But I do believe that we probably are not paying enough attention to just how well Kendrick sort of locked things down for Georgia on his side of the field a year ago. Now, the other point I want to make is this, is that people, I believe, have a tendency to be very judgmental of cornerbacks. And I think that people have a tendency to remember busts, and all of a sudden you sort of get the picture of a player being somewhat deficient in your mind because you saw him get beat. But sometimes good coverage is quiet. Like bad coverage is noisy. Everybody sees it when a cornerback gets beat. But good coverage can be relatively quiet by comparison, because sometimes good coverage means the quarterback doesn't even throw in that direction. Sometimes it's sort of hard to tell when a cornerback is doing what he's supposed to be doing, because it encourages a quarterback to make a different decision than he otherwise would make. So all of that's to sort of say this. When you play a team like Tennessee and they line receivers as wide as they line them up, and they throw as frequently as they do, you are not going to pitch a perfect game against that offense. You're just not. There are going to be moments when one of their receivers is just wide open. It just kind of becomes the law of big numbers. When you run as many deep routes and throw as many deep balls as Tennessee does, you're either going to have a receiver that's open and is just not complete, or a couple of big connections for a capable quarterback like Hendon Hooker. So holding your own when a team is like as high volume as Tennessee expects to be is not perfection. It's not limiting them to zero. That just to me is not a very realistic expectation. But can Georgia meet the task and get the job done? I truly believe that's the case, yes. Let's see what else. Foster Moss says he's got the Dogs beating the Falcons in a last-minute field goal. Whew. Things are rough for the Falcons these days. Our buddy AKA checking in. Haven't seen him in a while. He says, I've been sick lately. He says, but getting into the football season will make me feel tons better. Go Dogs. I know that's true, AKA. I am glad you are here today, and I am 100% with you on that. That a lot of what ails us seems to get better when those football games start being played, for sure. Did Christy give us some bad news? What did Christy say here? Christy and the idea of a Kiffin hater countdown. That's really funny. Really funny. Chase wanted the subject of quarterbacks making different decisions because of good cornerback play. Yeah, sometimes that's what it's all about. Ooh, Joshua Langford, this is a good question. He says, what storyline would you love to see coming out of fall camp by the end of it? Let me try to pick just one. Easy for me to say Eric Gilbert, because that'd be really fun to think that Georgia has a playmaker of that potential. Feeling really, to go back to the Darian Kendrick thing from a moment ago, feeling really good about another cornerback, I think would be really fun. But my one answer, if you give me one answer, my one storyline that I'd love to see, I'd love to hear effusive praise. And by the way, we will see some of this. Or we won't see it, but we'll hear about it. Because in a few weeks, there'll be a decent number of boosters that go to one of these scrimmages, and y'all, they are loose-lipped. They will be telling you everything. So we'll get some of this coming up in a few weeks. I'd love to hear some high praise for the Georgia running backs, whether it's one guy way out in front, or if it's McIntosh and Milton as a tandem, or if it's Dejon Edwards kind of forming a group with these guys again. If you gave me one thing I could hear as a really good storyline for summer camp or fall camp or whatever it is we call it, I will take praise for the running backs. Connor, do you agree?
I see your thinking there. I'm going to zag here. It's
Okay.
something I don't want to hear.
All right.
I don't want to hear a single injury note on any Georgia wide receivers. If you don't hear any of that, if as long as it's not, if it's like a hamstring or something small, if I don't hear any, health related stuff out of the wide receivers, I think this Georgia offense is going to do some damage week 1 against Oregon.
That's fun to think about. Is this why the last month seems to go by the longest? Because we wince. I'm talking about those of us who cheer for Georgia. We have a tendency to wince at every news report that comes out. Is that why the month of August feels like it lasts so long? Is because a lot of the news reports kind of leave you sort of like tepid. You're sort of timid to go in there and read it. Is that kind of what that's about, I wonder?
Yeah, there's almost no good news that ever comes out of fall camp. Or obvious good news. Like, you think, like, week of the Oregon game, Tate Ratledge really seems to have locked down that right guard spot. I know a lot of people were encouraged by that last year, but that's not something that is really good news out of one day. Or, a player having a great scrimmage, I don't think carries the same level of weight there.
But because this is the thing that Kirby Smart says, and this is like not coach pick, I believe it really is true, is, okay, if so-and-so had a great scrimmage, we are left to know, well, is that a good thing or not? Because he's playing against a Georgia player, so does that mean the other guy's not doing well? And Smart has openly acknowledged that. And I do think to a degree that's kind of true. And Connor says it in an interesting way. It's like, it's hard to have anything in camp happen that would truly rise the level of being good news, because you don't know if it's puffery or just maybe coming at the expense of another Georgia player. But we know what bad news looks like. Oh, boy, we've had plenty of that, especially at the receiver position. So avoiding that might be as good as anything.
Pretty much all of last year. You think Warren Erickson breaks his hand, I think the first or second day of fall camp. Eric Gilbert leaves the team. Darnell Washington and Tyke Smith both break their foots.
Yeah.
Jermaine Burton, JT Daniels, Kearis Jackson all dealing with various injuries that would impact them over the course of the season. Very little good news came out of fall camp last year.
I'm going to tell you this right now. I'm drawing my line in the sand. I'm putting my foot on the ground, or whatever the saying is about this. If somebody gets hurt, and eventually somebody probably is going to, the one thing I don't want to hear from you scribes is it's not expected to be serious. Because last year I heard 900 times that so-and-so wasn't expected to be serious, and 3 months later he still wasn't playing. Like I don't want to hear anybody saying it's not expected to be serious, because that hasn't worked out so well for Georgia fans the last 2 years there as well. So all you scribes over there in the Butts-Mehre Heritage Hall, just just keep that in mind there,
yeah,
too.
and I sort of wrote about this morning. I mean, Darnell Washington is the perfect example of this, of a guy who I think his injury last year, and most specifically when it happened in the year, he just never allowed him to get on the right track.
Yeah.
So I actually think injuries that occur in the month of August are a lot more, serious and long-ranging impactfully than sometimes people like to let on.
I think it changes the timeline of a season, Connor, and I think you're absolutely right about that. Very valuable practice time gets missed. All right, let me go to Facebook because I haven't been there yet today. And, of course, good stuff all the way around. Let's pull this up here. Naturally, it's loading slow, but we'll get some Facebook comments, and we'll get ready to bounce here in just a little bit. DawgNation.com will still get to you here in a minute, too. Zuckerberg's page is loading slow on us here for a moment. Let's try this again. Come on. All right, I don't know why this is going so slow. Let me go to DawgNation.com, and I'll come back to Facebook. I'm sure Jay is saying this is why I should never get off the YouTube page, because at least the YouTube page opens. All right, at DawgNation.com. Hemingway hoping we can start the year with a fully healthy, proven quarterback. Yeah, I mean, that's important there, too. That's important there as well. Grateful Dog also mentioning the BS defensive ranking, as he calls it, for Georgia in the all-time list. Yeah, I mean, so much of this is subjective. Like, the one thing I don't think you'll ever hear me say is, other than Michael Jordan being the GOAT, like, you'll never hear me say so-and-so is definitely the best whatever of all time. Because, I mean, okay, I have my opinion. You have your opinion. In some cases, there's evidence on both sides. But this Georgia team from this last year, it ain't the 17th best defense of all time. I'm just telling you right now, it ain't. It ain't. And that's bad grammar, intentional. I don't know if it's the first. I don't know if it's the second. It's not the 17th. And as I said before, on a show like this, during this portion of the show, we take a bunch of comments from like rival fans all the time. We never had one fan last year that said, you Georgia people are so in love with this defense, it's not even one of the 20 best of all time. Like, not even like partisan Georgia haters would say this is the 17th best defense of all time. So I don't care, like if that's what your calculator says, you need to get a new calculator. And just 1,000,000%, this is why, after having spent a long time in kind of like the advanced stats analytics community, I basically just thrown the whole thing in the trash. And like, this is an example why. The circle of people who care about that kind of stuff never gets any larger because of the people who exist in the circle. Brian Whitehead says, Auburn players talking a lot of smack about breaking the UGA streak win against them. I suspect Auburn will be 2-3 when they come to Athens. What say UBA? That's interesting. Let's look at this Auburn schedule for a moment. I'm going to try to talk and do this at the same time, because the game being earlier is kind of an interesting deal. All right. And last year we said this, that Auburn had a chance to have that home game really matter when they played Georgia, and ultimately it didn't really work out that way. So this is what Auburn's doing. Woo, boy. Wow. So they play Mercer week 1. They play San Jose State week 2. A couple of years ago, San Jose State was good, but I'm guessing that's probably not the truth anymore. But a couple of years ago, Brian Harsin would not have been a guaranteed win against San Jose State. Back when, what's his name? The SEC quarterback was there. What was his name? Yeah, Nick Starkel was there. He was the quarterback. A couple of years ago, they were pretty good, but I don't know how good they'll be this year. But how about this? They play Penn State week 3. Now, it's a home game, but Penn State may be pretty good this year. They play Missouri week 4. That should be no big deal. They play LSU week 5. Is that week 5? And they're at Georgia the following week. And how about this? So this is consecutive weeks for. I mean, this Auburn schedule, man. Brian Harsin will be lucky to even coach in the Iron Bowl. So listen to this. Starting October 1st, they play LSU. The following week, they're at Georgia. The week after that, they're at Ole Miss. Then they're off. Then they play Arkansas. Then they're at Mississippi State. Then they play Texas A&M. There's not an obvious win. There's not a guaranteed win for a month and a half for the Tigers. They play Western Kentucky, who much the same way, more years than not, pretty good. That's their game prior to playing Alabama. Y'all, it could be a disaster for Auburn. That's a very hard schedule. That's a very hard schedule. How many games are they even favored in? Now, playing at home, they'll get a little bit of a boost in some of these games for playing at home. Oh, my gosh, is that a hard schedule? So the commenter said 2-3 prior to playing Georgia. So give them Mercer, give them San Jose State. I'd take Penn State and LSU against them. Could they be 3-2 maybe? But having already lost at least twice, coming into a stadium that you haven't won in since 2005, I believe is the right number. What a disaster. Oh my gosh, that schedule. Could not happen to a better bunch either. But wow. If we did comment of the day, this would be our comment of the day. Brian Whitehead. Like, if I could frame this comment, I would. He says, Auburn fans are looking past Mercer. It's actually Mercer's second game. And you do know this. You improve more from week 1 to week 2 than any point in time in the season. So Brian Whitehead thinks that that Auburn's looking past the Mercer Bears there on that, which is very funny. Very funny. That's the Fromm Bowl, right? A couple of Fromm brothers have spent time at both those schools. Jesse S. On the subject of Stetson Bennett saying Stetson doesn't need to do much different this year. Play like he did last year, and the results will be better considering our upgraded wide receivers, running backs, and offensive line. Yeah, you certainly hope for upgrades at all those positions. And we'll see how that plays out. That's a good comment. All right, let's see if we can get Facebook to open. What is going on over here? Let me try my phone for a minute on Facebook. It is just not wanting to participate here on the laptop today. So let's see if we can get it. Let's see if we can pull up a few phone comments, and then we got to go after that. All right, DawgNation. Here we go.
Yes, on the subject.
All right. Sandy Price says my number one fall camp storyline. Teams are about to find out why Kirby never used the portal. That's interesting. Now, to be fair, though, Kirby did say at SEC Media Days they did go after some transfer players, just didn't get them. But ultimately, there is some confidence in what Georgia does have. And, Georgia in kind of the luxurious position of not being desperate for someone in the portal. I think you are right about that. Jonathan Aaron says on the Pat McAfee show the other day, there were some of us calling in saying that we would lose week 1. And McAfee said that we lost most of our defense, but we are on a Bama level now. We have so much talent. It's almost criminal. He said he doesn't see us losing. Well, there you go. Not only is Pat McAfee an up-and-coming professional wrestler, he's also pretty astute when it comes to his college football observations as well, I guess. I'll tell you who else is a pretty good wrestler, and I promise we won't talk about wrestling. Is it Logan Paul? Is the guy's name? I'm amazed at some of these guys who haven't spent a long time wrestling, how good they can be. Bad Bunny was pretty good a couple of years ago. Logan Paul's pretty good. McAfee's pretty good. Like, participating in a professional wrestling match is not an easy thing to do, but some of these non-wrestlers have actually made it look pretty easy lately. Let's see what else. Sam Burke says, what's your take on Chaz Chambliss and his role at linebacker? He looked pretty good against Tennessee coming off the edge. I have to admit something. Like, Chaz Chambliss is probably a better outside linebacker than I gave him credit for being. Like, Chambliss was, I thought, a pretty big dude coming out of high school, Carrollton, and like he's about as rocked up as you're going to see somebody be. I sort of thought he might be a defensive end. I sort of thought that maybe he'd have a hard time being an outside linebacker, that he might be a little bit more of a 3-4 defensive end. But you mentioned the Tennessee game. There were a couple of moments last year in kind of some of those late game duties where I thought, God, he looks pretty good. So I get plenty of evaluations wrong. That's why I don't, take myself too seriously as a scout. But Chambliss was not a guy that I thought necessarily had a super high ceiling, maybe at one point in time an outside linebacker. I thought he might gravitate more to a little bit different position. But as it turns out, he's actually, probably a pretty promising guy for sure. Hugh Nash says missing in the transfer portal can be a good thing. I totally agree with you on that. mean, I think that when you take a lot of transfer players, and Alabama may be the example of this, and this has been a hot topic, obviously, this offseason, I think you do have to have some concerns about team chemistry, something that Georgia does not have to be concerned about right now. Dana Turk checking in. Always good to see Dana here. Jerry Popham checking in there as well. He says, no, it's very scary that BA even knows the names of so many pro wrestlers. Yeah, listen, we all have things that we like, I guess. Johnny Robinson says, let's have a spelling bee contest. There's a pretty good chance you're a better speller than I am. There's a very good chance that you're a better speller than me. Let's see what else. Shane Taylor says Gilbert and Bauer is going to lead us to another national championship. I like the idea of that. A couple of great tight ends. John Foster says, oh, wow, thanks so much for making it to Facebook. In fairness, I have tried to make it to Facebook. I don't know why it wouldn't open on my laptop. I really don't know why. But we're here now and having a good time. Let's see what else. Ken Holcomb says the Tennessee offense is not sustainable at that fast a pace unless you have great depth. Right now, they do not. Gimmick offenses seldom win championships. I, for the most part, agree with all of that. I really do. I think the thing about Tennessee is that right now they are a dangerous team week to week for most teams. But if you go that finesse, I mean, I'm talking about spreading you out. Like, I don't know that anybody spreads out wider than Tennessee does. They have receivers on the other side of the numbers. And, I mean, I had it told to me by, like, people, like, sort of in the profession that they play the fastest of anybody, that no one runs the pace they run. No one spreads as wide as they do. It really is, you call it a gimmick offense. It is certainly gimmicky in the fact that it's unlike almost anything anybody else does. And oftentimes you find out, well, there's a reason that people don't do this. When you have it spread that wide, it can be hard to sustain any running game whatsoever. When you're playing that fast, it can put a lot of pressure on your defense. Now, there are a lot of people who would say, even though Tennessee sort of barely cracked the top 100 defensively a year ago, that when you look at what they lost defensively when Jeremy Pruitt exited the program, that actually they probably played above their head defensively last year. That I think, once again, sort of smart people sort of inside the coaching profession had kind of led me to believe that they were actually kind of impressed with some of the defensive stuff from Tennessee last year, just given how deficient their talent level was. Relative to expectations, they probably played better than they had a right to. But as you try to move on and become, what I think this year can be a top 25 team to, something above that in the future, you can't be all just gimmick offense. You can't. No matter how good your quarterback and your wide receivers are, you got to run the ball. You got to play defense. You have to have some of those things that have always mattered in football. You've got to have some of that. And it is fair to wonder if Tennessee's going to. Because eventually, if you're a defense that's willing to sort of wait it out, you can wait that out. Eric DeVorncy wants to see Kirby shock the world and come out wearing the all-white uniforms against Oregon. That would be a shocking deal there for sure. That would be a very shocking deal. Let's see what else. Miriam Corbin going to be with us at the Duck Hunt Tailgate. I'm looking forward to that. That's awesome. Really looking forward to that. That's good stuff. Wait, is this true? I'm just seeing this. Pardon me for pausing here. So this is just coming out here. Lars Tate has passed away. Man, this is terribly sad news. Lars Tate was, I was a big fan. He was one of the first great Georgia running backs that I really cheered for. I have a picture taken with Tate when the Butts-Mehre Heritage Hall first opened there. Very good player at UGA. This would have been like 86, 87, around that era. A very, very good player. Became a draft pick. I don't have the biography in front of me, but I believe is a first-round pick of the Tampa Bay Bucks. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. Certainly a NFL level running back. very sad news there. Very sad news. Thank you all for making me aware of that. I did not know about the passing here. Chip's got a story up on this at AJC.com, but so I don't know any of the details. But certainly gone too young is Lars Tate here. David Johnson saying from cancer. Man, that's terrible news. Terrible news. I was a big fan of Lars Tate. That's just kind of the era in which I got really heavy into Georgia football. That mid-'80s era is when I started going to a lot of games, and Tate was, Georgia was kind of like this RBU type school, and when I got into Georgia football, Tate was the guy there. In 87, that's when Ronnie Hampton came as a freshman, so you had sort of like that Tate-Hampton duo, and then, of course, Hampton stayed on beyond that and kind of became the same version of that with Tim Worley the following year. But Lars Tate was a very good player, and very, very sad news. I did not know he was battling cancer. I don't know him really personally, but I had certainly cheered for him when I was a kid, and one of the proud moments for me was meeting him right there in the locker room. This is, for those Georgia players who may be tuning in, the kids that you could get a chance to connect with, they remember it forever, because I still remember, Lars, patting me on my shoulder, patting me on the back, bringing me in for a picture. That's a big deal to me, a very big deal, and very sad to hear about his passing, apparently at the age of 56. Philip Jordan Wells kind of mentioned him in that lineage with he and Ronnie Hampton. They actually played together, I believe, in 87, so they were part of that same team together, but some good Georgia teams near the end of the Dooley era. Dooley's final year was in 88, so Tate would have been with him, my memory, for those last couple of years of the Dooley era. So incredibly sad. But I appreciate you all sharing that with me. Just really sad news. It's a little bit late. Let me take one or two more comments and see if we can, get a couple of final thoughts in here. Randy Hall says we need to promote Jalen Carter for the Heisman. He is definitely one of the guys who would have a chance to be a part of that discussion. I think it's real to have a defensive player in that mix. Obviously, Anderson's going to get some of that attention from Alabama. Hutchinson was one of the finalists a year ago, so it's certainly a possibility. Randy Glass says, who's the leading quarterback prospect we're in the lead for in 2024? It's been kind of Jaden Davis and Julian Sayin been the two guys that you've kind of watched most closely. Of course, that Davis did just take a visit to Georgia this past weekend. We may read some more from Jeff Sentell about that at DawgNation.com coming up in the days ahead. And you're going to have two camps between those who might like to have a say in, because he might be a really good fit for the Todd Monken offense, and a guy like Jaden Davis in this part of the country up there in North Carolina, who's a spectacular athlete. J. Bob says, do I still have that photo? Let me see if I can find that. Let me see if I can, because that'd be a cool thing to show. Let me see if I can find that. The photo he's asking about was the one with me and Lars Tate from when I was a kid. But that'd be a proud thing for me to show off, because that was a big memory for me from way back then. My grandfather used to take me to the games and stuff like that. So sad about that news. Scott Harris said, where did Lars Tate play his pro ball? I believe he was a draft pick of the Tampa Bay Bucks, I believe. And that's kind of coming from memory here. Let me see if I can quickly search that. But I believe it was the Tampa Bay Bucks. And I don't quite remember what round it was. So it was the second round of the 88 draft, taken by Tampa in the second round of the 88 draft. And, that's a pretty, high draft pick kind of status here. Is the 53rd overall pick. He played for the Bucks in 88 and 89, according to Wikipedia, and played for the Bears in 90. I don't really remember him being with the Bears, but I do remember him being with the Bucks. I kind of remember that I sort of picture the 89 sort of that Pro Set card with the Tampa Bay, the old creamsicle uniform. Kind of remember that. I think that may have been his first card. Maybe I can't remember if he was in the 88 top set or not, but I sort of have a picture of that. Just sad day. I don't know. It takes you back to your childhood for those of you who are old enough to remember that for sure. All right. Final thoughts here. Raphael Wright says RIP to a DGD. No doubt about that. Wire Room, excited about Stetson Bennett. We are there as well. Spencer Clark says Gunnar Stockton just sounds like a champion. I mean, as far as the name game goes, it'd be very hard to have a better sounding name than Gunnar Stockton. There's no question about that. There's no question about that. On Facebook for the final time here, and we're going to be ready to go. Somebody celebrating a birthday today. Who's celebrating a birthday? I didn't see this from earlier. But happy birthday. Sorry I missed that, but happy birthday today. Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you for being here. Spencer Clark said, do you remember Arthur Marshall? I definitely do. Former Georgia wide receiver. Remember Marshall very, very well. I think he was one of those guys. I may be wrong about this. Did he get a 6 year of eligibility? I may be confusing him with somebody else, but I definitely remember Arthur Marshall, the former Georgia wide receiver. All right, so good stuff. Glad you all are. Joel Moody, happy birthday to you. That's how we'll finish things off today. Happy birthday to Joel Moody. That's awesome. I'm really glad that you're able to celebrate some of that with us here today. Certainly appreciate that. Y'all check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online, ajc.com. As I mentioned, Chip Towers got a little bit of a look back on the life of Lars Tate, who we find out passes away today. Certainly gone too soon from us. A beloved former Georgia Bulldog, at least certainly from my era for sure. And Braves also make a lot of moves yesterday as the Major League Baseball trade deadline nears its end today. But the Braves bringing in some starting pitching, getting another outfielder, making some moves there. And by the way, also a big contract extension for Austin Riley, locking him down. And what a good timing to announce that after Riley had one of the better months any Braves ever had. And I think putting himself squarely in the National League MVP conversation. I believe that's what Austin Riley's doing right now. So good time to be announcing that contract for him. You can read a lot more of that online, ajc.com. Also, big thanks to our friends at at RS Andrews, bringing the RS Andrews cool down to you. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. You can trust them to do all that for you. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust RS Andrews on all of that. Water heater, if it goes out, in many cases, they can replace it for you the same day. So find them online at rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll talk to you then, everybody.